Welcome to the Hard to Kill podcast, the official podcast of the Hard to Kill program, the world's leading program for driven individuals looking to gain direction and momentum, where we aim to break down the complex, multifaceted and holistic factors of human performance and optimization. Both on the program and on this podcast, we will be discussing and excavating everything pertaining to psychological resilience, physical robustness, and leading by example with discipline and tenacity to create a culture of winning, especially in the turbulent, frenetic, and high-tempo world of the ambitious individual. This is Mark, the creator, senior DS, and head coach of the Hard to Kill program. Let's get stuck straight into it. So in today's episode, I wanted to cover strength and conditioning for jiu-jitsu. So I've made the decision to split this into a multi-part series, if you want to call it that, simply because there is so much ground to cover, not only looking at strength, but also looking at considerations for conditioning, i.e. energy systems, flexibility and recoverability. I felt like it would just be too much to cover in one conversation. So we're going to split up into multiple. And today, largely, we're going to be discussing and talking about the strength continuum and actual strength coaching for improved performance in grappling sports and specifically Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, okay? So I want to start with a preemptive strike here, okay? Understand that I am not a prolific high-level competitor in any grappling sport or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm not a black belt. I am a blue belt under Cam Atakuru at ASW Manchester, okay? Arguably one of the best gyms in the country, definitely one of the best in the north and certainly the best in the northwest. But often in any sport, in fact, pretty much in every case, in any sport you wish to consider or discuss, the strength and conditioning coach is rarely, if ever, a high-level competitor in that sport. The skills coach has to be by design. So to clarify, the individual who's actually teaching you Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, catch wrestling, MMA, whatever, really should have an extensive history and a plethora of experiences in that specific sport. They should be, a senior belt, ideally a black belt coming from a good lineage and have a competitive background that help you to understand you're in safe hands, that they are able to walk the walk as well as just talk the talk. It's imperative that you understand that. But in any sport, the role of a strength and conditioning coach is actually not to just be world-class at the sport, is to be able to do a needs analysis, is to be able to essentially absorb information extraordinarily well, is be able to look at a sport objectively and start asking questions such as, okay, like what shapes do these athletes need to make? What energy systems is being most taxed in these environments? How do we fortify and make an athlete more robust so we can mitigate some of the non-contact injuries associated with the sport? How can we even look at tenderness and muscular hypertrophy so that, we can arguably make their joints, the tendons, ligaments a little bit stronger, a little bit less injury prone, etc., so on and so forth. So I want to make that very clear. Definitely don't listen to me if you think that I'm going to teach you how to do the fucking perfect armbar setup. That's not the case. We are going to be discussing how strength can be programmed and applied to improve the performance of a grappling athlete, and again specifically reference to jiu-jitsu. Now I'm very fortunate, as I just mentioned, that I train out of ASW in Manchester, which is an extraordinarily brilliant gym, absolutely packed to the rafters from grassroots talents right through to guys who, is evident and obvious that they're going to go the full distance in their fighting career. Guys that are fighting and competing in ADCC, multiple Grapple Fest appearances right through to Cam himself, who I'm sure needs no explanation, is an absolute fucking savage. And I'd actually love in the future, in subsequent parts of this series, to get Cam in and do kind of like an open conversation and maybe share his thoughts as well to ratify and verify what it is that I'm discussing. But above and beyond all that, there's some seriously talented athletes. So even just outside of their capacity and ability to demonstrate a skill set in jiu-jitsu, they are just phenomenal athletes. They're very strong, very robust, like all of the assets and attributes that we would aspire to have in our strength and conditioning in order to make us better at the sport. So I want to definitely kind of preempt that. Moving forward, what I want to also help you understand is that today, rather than just go through reductionist kind of tactics of do this exercise, perform this many sets and reps, we're going to talk through high contour strategic questions, okay? So what I want to do is I want to give you a kind of behind the scenes of how we would aspire to operate as good strength and conditioning coaches to begin to solve these problems, so that rather than just going away and doing an exercise from out of sets and reps, that's not going to help you. That's the epitome of giving you a fish. Pretty soon that fish will go fucking rotten. What I want to teach you to do is I want to give you the fishing rod. I want to teach you kind of how to cast and how to reel in so that you can actually, fish and feed yourself indefinitely moving forward. And that's only going to happen, as I'm, pretty synonymous with saying, is not if you look at the logistical, but if you look at the psychological. So how do we think about this? How can we critically appraise? How can we analyze what it is an individual needs, and how can we meet those needs in an effort to deliver on the desired outcome? Okay, so let's get stuck straight into it. With all that being said, the first kind of key point that I have is that the first question that we would stumble into when we look at, okay, how we're going to deliver strength for this athlete. And that is, well, how do you want to play the game? So if we look at jiu-jitsu, there are an enormous different varieties and styles with which you can play the game. Are you, as many of us are at ASW, for example, are you a wrestling dominant player? Do you like to hold and maintain top position and control and pin and squeeze your opponent on the bottom? If so, fantastic. What shapes do you need to make to facilitate that, and where do we need to be strong? But that's only one element and area, because equally in the same sport, you can also have somebody who loves to play off their back, who has got a very, very active guard, maybe even some rubber guard in there, throwing up a lot of attacks off their back. They look at to invert, take the legs, blah, 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 etc., etc. So even though essentially these are the same sport, as I'm sure you can imagine and appreciate for those who do grapple and do train for it, they require extraordinarily different skill sets. And as a result, extraordinarily different attributes. This is very little point in as well. I'm not going to say there's little point, but what we wouldn't want to do is start coaching a process rather than coaching the person. So the first thing we need to understand, and the first question that needs to be asked and answered is how do you want to play the game? Now, for me to share from my personal experiences and my insight, and we're going to come to this more in the second question of what is your intent. But for me, I'm not a prolific competitor. I'm not, in all honesty, that interested or motivated by what I would call sport grappling that seems to be going down a trend of real non-combative approaches, just looking to get the job done quickly as possible. So it's pulling guard, it's scooting, and then it's looking for a leg entry and taking a leg lock, and you can finish the game in less than 15 seconds. I definitely understand why that is done. I definitely see its merits and its benefits. But for me, my intent, and it is for a lot of guys as well, our intent behind jiu-jitsu and grappling is simply for self-mastery. It's doing something that's really quite hard and takes an enormous amount of determination and willpower and resilience over decades in order to get to something like mastery and get that eluded black belt for myself, and then obviously continue to grow and evolve and thrive off the back of that. That's kind of my intent. But in the meantime, it's very much about just kind of completing me as an athlete, as a human, as someone who aspires to be hard to kill. And the times in which I would think, okay, what would I be able to do if it were fucking outside of Wetherspoons on a Friday night? What would I be able to do if I came up against Karen and she was panic buying and it was me versus her in Tesco's for the last multi-pack of bog roll? What have I got in my locker there? That's very much how I kind of approach jiu-jitsu and how I sort of train for it. So understand the first question you want to ask yourself is, okay, so how do you actually want to play the game? What are your skills? What are your weaknesses? What would you like to work on? And then off the back of that, we can immediately ask another question. You understand now how you want to play the game? Well, what shapes do you need to make? In order to be good at playing jiu-jitsu in that way and in grappling in that way, what shapes do you need to make? So let's take the example of a guy who's pretty wrestling dominant, who wants to shoot for a takedown, hold top position, pin, control, smother, and then work up the chain and eventually look for an arm lock or a choke or whatever. Okay, so what shapes does that individual need to make in order to be able to do that really very well? Well, we can then start answering those questions when we actually come to, right, what lifts do we need to be performing? What exercises do we need to be performing in our strength and conditioning sessions? And what I want to make very, very clear here, and I'll touch on this again later, but we are not trying to replicate the movements you perform on the mats. I cannot say that enough. I cannot reiterate that enough. I'll say it again until I'm blue in the face, because one thing I see, arguably the biggest pitfall with grapplers and jiu-jitsu practitioners, is they go in the gym and they try and replicate. Okay, understand, if you're on the mat for 2, 4, 6, 10 hours per week, trust me, you're getting enough exposure to that movement pattern and you're at risk, above and beyond anything else, of actual pattern overload injuries, because you're doing it not like however many thousands of repetitions per week on the mat, and you're doing it again in the gym under load, shit is going to break. So when we ask the question of what shapes do you want to make, do not believe that means you're trying to replicate it in the gym. It simply means we need to understand the kind of the biomechanics and anatomy, physiology behind it of, okay, how can we fortify those movement patterns so you're able to do it? Likewise, if we get a guy who wants to play off his back, who loves leg locks, who's always looking to invert and roll and kind of gather in a leg and then attack a heel hook, we've got some guys who are like brilliant, Abraham Duran to name others at the gym at ASW, who are absolutely fantastic at doing that. But you are going to need to develop slightly different attributes to be really, really proficient at that. It's not to say that you're not going to be good at all of them. I think generally jiu-jitsu practitioners would aspire to be good at all things, but at some point, the better you get, you're going to go down an avenue that either you enjoy the most, or that you get the most success with, or that you're most passionate about, and you're going to want to prepare slightly more and leaning in favor of that way. So obviously in that situation, we're going to be looking at hip mobility, at the dexterity mobility around the lower limbs, our ability to flex the trunk and actually able to invert ourselves. Maybe look at the strength of elevating someone up. So how we're going to be able to produce the force when we're upside down on the back of our neck to push our legs up and elevate that guy, get them over us. So you've got to look at what shape do you want to make. And we're not just trying to replicate that. We actually have to look at fortifying it. And that kind of leads us neatly to the whole point of strength and conditioning in the first place, which is essentially to build attributes and to build strengths and to fortify areas in a way that sport-specific practice itself cannot. So get really clear on that definition. The purpose of strength and conditioning, and this is kind of ad-lib by the way, the purpose of strength and conditioning is not to just re-ingrain motor patterns that you can do in skill-specific practice. It is to build strength and attributes and capabilities that are not able to be built in sport-specific practice. Okay, so now we've run through, well, how do you want to play the game and what shapes do you need to make? Okay, so for an example, if you are that wrestling-based guy, your deadlift's going to be a pretty fucking solid bet, because you're going to be in that mid-range of hip flexion, you're going to be hip extending, so driving through the glutes, and it doesn't take a genius to look at, okay, let's look at the postures that we have when we are facing up, when we're hand fighting, when we're trying to tie up the collar, when we're looking at making shots. We are going to be in that mid to end range of hip flexion. We're going to be driving through the posterior chain, even right through to suplexing, any of those things. And then if we look at, okay, so we're on the ground, we're now pinning that guy, our weight is up on our toes, we're driving shoulder and we're driving heavy into him. There's a lot of core rigidity and intersegmental stability that's required. We're starting to now get an understanding of what shapes we need to make. Whereas if, again, I'm playing like heavily proficiently off my back and I've got my fucking knees to my ears and I'm playing some fucking weird fucked up rubber guard looking for an armor platter, then we're going to need to be very, very strong in that end range of hip flexion. So we need enormous amounts of capsule mobility in and around the hip. We need good strength and mobility around the lower back as well. Like there's a whole host of different things going on there. So really start to understand. That's the first question we'd ask. The second question is then, well, what is your intent? As I've alluded to, for me, it's about self-mastery. It's about being a very, very well-rounded athlete. It's because I fucking love it. It gives me that ability to compete and to lay hands on another bloke and just get after it multiple times per week. And so it kind of falls between self-defense and also just enjoyment and being a hobbyist. Okay, but there are also people who are sport competitors. Okay, and as I've spoken to, there are many guys who are at the highest echelons of competition here in the UK and even in Europe now at ASW. So they are training, 4, 5, sometimes 6 and beyond times per week, and it's hard rounds multiple times per week. So when you're able to answer that question, you can then start understanding this will influence the ratio and hierarchy of your strength versus your skill sessions. So for me, grappling probably takes about 66% priority. I say about 66 because I'm just loosely referring to 2/3. About 2/3 of my priority across the course of a week. The other remaining third is then strength and endurance and not looking like a bag of milk. But, largely grappling has my primary attention at this present moment. So if I'm in a bit of a situation where I'm planning out a week and I think, I could train jiu-jitsu there, but I also could do strength, and it's relatively 50-50 decision, I'm going to come down in the favor of getting on the mats because, that's my priority at this present moment. Whereas if there are time considerations, if jiu-jitsu or grappling is not your main priority and intent, then you may well opt to side with the strength and conditioning session. And again, that's totally fine. You're not wrong in that whatsoever. It's about actually understanding and being very, very confident with what your intent is. Because what I have seen over my time in the sport is individuals will come in obviously at a white belt level, and it's addictive. Anyone who's listening to this, and I would suggest the vast majority of you, if you are listening to this, have been involved or have been involved with jiu-jitsu at some point in time, know how fucking addictive it is. It literally is like a drug the first couple of times. Well, it's just addictive full stop. And, you go home and you can't fucking sleep at night because it's racing through your mind like, how do I escape that and how to do this? And he did that and that was fucking sick. I want to be able to do that, etc. and so on. So yeah, what we tend to see as individuals who are quite new to the sport is they almost feel like there's an external expectation that because it's so addictive and it's so fun, that maybe there's pressure on them for them to compete and it needs to be, they're everything. I know I certainly fell kind of victim to that in my first exposure to training because it was so fun, and I've looked at the guys around me who were brilliant and they were so supportive and they were bringing me on. I thought, I want to do really, really well at this. I want to fucking smash the ass out of it. Almost felt guilty for not training. Almost felt guilty for taking time off the mats. And I definitely deprioritized other things. So if you've been through that and if you experienced it, I'm going to be very open and honest about that. Understand that it is normal. But one of the more the senior brown belts at ASW was actually kind of to say to me something that he realized a long time ago in his jiu-jitsu career was it's not about who's best, it's about who's left. Okay. And that really resonated and that really rung true with me, because if you want to go down the competitive grappling scene, obviously you need to be best. But also if you want to be doing this with the same intent that I have for self-mastery, maybe a little bit of self-defense, whatever it may be, and I aspire to be training it for the next 20, 30, 40 years for as long as I physically, practically can, then
I have to train like I want to be training for as long as I practically can. So it's not about like just being a bitch and being like, oh, well, I know I want to take a stay, I don't want to get injured. Like, it's not about like fucking being a bitch and only picking only picking easy rounds, sorry. But it is about looking at the training load and what we're doing from a strength perspective to fortify our body and allow us to stay supple and stay robust, and just making smart fucking decisions, knowing when, your ego is going to be present in jiu-jitsu. It needs to be, because you want to fucking win. Anyone who says leave your ego at the door is probably a pussy. I'm being really honest with you, because it's just false humility of, oh no, I don't mind if I win, you're better than me. Well, fucking get better. Stop being a fucking absolute pussy about it and train to win. But where we draw the line is what you are prepared to do to take that win. Because if you are going to just hold on and let someone basically snap your arm because you don't want to tap, if you are going to, in the reverse of that, pull someone's fucking shoulder out of socket just because you want to win training, that is where ego is going to become toxic. So when you understand if longevity is part of your game plan, if you want to do this for the next 30, 40 years, then yeah, you need to have an ego in training, because you essentially want to win whenever you appropriately can, but you also don't want to make decisions and hold on against subs or do things that are going to like accelerate the rate of wear and tear on your body. That means it's not going to be possible for you. So yeah, that's what you've also got to consider is question number 2, what is your intent? Is it competition? Is it self-defense? Or is it hobbyist? Because then that will influence the kind of attribution of time across the course of the week. If you're a competitor, realistically, you're probably going to need to be on the mats 4 times per week. That's something you have to face, and that's something you'll enjoy if you want to compete, which means that you only have a finite amount of energy, time, and recoverability. So your S&C will probably be 2 sessions per week. Whereas if you are like the epitome of a hobbyist, probably leaning towards where I'm at, you might get 3 or even 4 S&C sessions in per week, and then maybe get 2 or 3 jiu-jitsus in. Be really, really understanding of that and have no emotional attachment to it. Just look at it objectively. Okay, imagine that you are programming and writing for somebody else. It removes that emotional attachment. Off the back of that, it brings us to question number 3, which is, okay, so how would we structure a week? And now you can understand how that would be influenced by your intent. So the second influencing factor in structuring a week is going to be your gym's timetable. Okay, because largely you'll be able to train with strength or get to the gym at a much more flexible kind of time span, because most gyms are open 24 hours these days, or you can go in and around work, you can go morning, go lunchtime, but there's only going to be a very, very set and finite amount of times and classes that you're able to attend. So the first thing I would do is get hold of your gym's timetable if you don't already have it, and look at, okay, specifically which classes do I want to go to, and maybe even have a conversation with the black belt or your professor and say, which classes do you think I would really value from going to? Which one would you say is a non-negotiable for me to be in attendance to in order for me to get better? For me, typically that's a Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So I'll typically do like a no-gi session at 7:30, and then if the energy is good, I'll then stay and do a gi session at 8:30 till 9. We'll do that Tuesday and Thursday, and then Saturday I'll do some wrestling and just an open mat with no-gi. So that is the first things that I program into my week planner, because I know those are non-negotiable. I know those are not floating. They are fixed times that I need to adhere to if I want to meet their training sessions. And then in the gaps in between, that then allows you to program in your strength work. So when we're structuring a week, what is a fantastic practice, irrespective of whether you train jiu-jitsu, whether you're an endurance athlete, it doesn't matter, is to use a traffic light system and understanding what is a red intensity day, what is an amber intensity day, and what is a green intensity day. The solid rule here is that the absolutely only green intensity day is a rest day. Okay. And you should aim to never have 2 red days back to back. Okay. So for example, if you need to train jiu-jitsu 2 days back to back, you would avoid doing really, really hard rounds both of those days, because it's probably going to start leading you towards non-functional overreaching, pattern overload injuries, tendonitis, tendinopathies, a general decremental decrease in your performance over time as allostatic load increases that you're not able to clear, etc. So you would typically look to those as golden rules. So in an ideal world, maybe you're training like me on a Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So on Monday, we might do a strength session. Okay, so that would be like an amber day. And then Tuesday, we're going to do a jiu-jitsu session. So if I'm doing 2 hours of hard rounds at ASW, that's going to be a red day. So that leaves us with Wednesday. What do we want to do on Wednesday? Wednesday could either be a green day, i.e. rest, or it could be an amber day, i.e. do another strength session. But knowing that I've got another red day on the Thursday, it's like, okay, tell you what, I'm going to take Wednesday as a rest, so I'll stick that as a green. I've got a red again on Thursday, and then I can maybe get an amber in so another strength session on Friday, and then I can get a red in on Saturday, again wrestling, and then I can get a green on Sunday. So across the course of the week, you've adhered to those rules. You've never got 2 rest days back to back, which is something that we reserve for a deload week. You've never got 2 red days back to back, which is something we reserve for deliberately overreaching you. So it really works out pretty well. And that is, again, context dependent and specific. That is speaking to someone who is not, I don't want to say not that advanced, but maybe hasn't got a really long training history of intense training. So if you look at really high level athletes, they're going to be able to train multiple times per day, because if that's largely their sole priority, their sole consideration, it is their job to do so. They're able to sleep throughout the day. They're able to have total control over the nutritional protocols and all their recoverability drills. Then their capacity to generate that output and recover from it is going to be where it needs to be. For most individuals, whether you're serving the military, whether you just have like a full-time job, whether you have like a home environment, you've got young children, then you have multiple other things like pouring into that same cup of stress. You can't always necessarily rely on a full 8 hours of sleep. You are going to have kinetic and stressful days at work. You're not going to nap in the middle of the day. Caffeine consumption might be a little bit too high, so on and so forth. So in those situations and circumstances, I would largely dissuade people from trying to train twice per day, because although you might be able to manage it for like 3-4 weeks, what again you'll notice is a decremental decrease in performance. Allostatic load is rising, so quality of thinking drops, procrastination starts to come in. You start to want to become avoidant of some sessions, like you start to get aches, injuries, and niggles. Like the body keeps the fucking score. You can tell yourself you're fine as much as possible, and the reality is with high performance and ambitious people, you'll be able to mask almost all the psychological conditions and shows of stress because you've done it for so long, and you try to condition that it's fine, but the body keeps a score and it will fucking catch up with you. Of that, I have absolutely no shadow of a doubt. Been there, done it probably 50 times. Over the years, I've conditioned myself to have slightly higher recoverability. And the best way to not have a recoverability issue is to never lose work capacity, but that's easier said than done. Again, if you've been building a young family, or you've got professional stresses, etc., and you have to really understand that, and you have to be able to give yourself empathy and be compassionate to yourself. I do see a lot of people self-deprecating and really essentially just smashing their fucking head against the wall because they're trying to train like a professional athlete. These guys that they're seeing and following on Instagram and social media, and it's like comparison in this circumstance is a thief of joy, and you are just setting yourself up for a failure by not being realistic with the expectations. And it's almost a degree of entitlement, if I'm really honest, if you expect that you're able to emulate and replicate that, when the truth is, exactly as I alluded to not 5 minutes ago, it's not about who's best, it's about who's left. And if you want to do it for the next fucking 20 years, then stop trying to rush to get a black belt, because it ain't going to happen. It's not going to help anybody. Make sure you're recovering, because those of you who have gone down that trap of essentially burning themselves out and then have experienced appropriate and proper rest will be able to speak to the fact that your jiu-jitsu gets so much better, so much quicker when you're actually resting and recovering. You don't gas out as quickly in rounds. You're able to actually think. It's like your motor patterns already know what's happening with, you'll know when your grappling is good versus when it's labored and when you feel fucking tired and someone's just running all over you and it just feels awful. Often, the appropriate amount of rest will mitigate that. So yeah, in terms of structuring a week, that was point number 3. Let's look at the traffic light system, and let's look at never having 2 reds together as much as we can avoid it, and never having 2 greens together as much as we can avoid it if we want optimal training load. And then to recap, if you are not a professional athlete and if you have a relatively young training age in terms of training with intensity, I would dissuade you from double training days at this point. It doesn't mean they can't be in your future. For me, I train twice a day, roughly 3 times per week, sometimes 4, but that's largely because I've been doing this training in that way pretty much non-stop for the past 10 plus years. Okay, so I've built that work capacity, and that's not highlighting myself as a poster boy. I know there are other guys, I've never really spoken to him, but I followed Owen Livesey. How could you not fucking be inspired by that guy on Instagram and social media? And yeah, he's training multiple times per day and he's an absolute fucking savage. He's enormously well put together, phenomenal athlete, intense competitor. Do not compare and contrast yourself to him in a negative sense, because obviously he's spent years working in the sport. He has a great understanding of how to be efficient, how to push himself, also how to recover, how to build his nutrition around that, and a whole lot of other considerations. But largely, he has done the reps, he has done the years to build that level of work capacity to facilitate him doing that. So, I know it's very easy to think, he's doing that, it must be possible. Yeah, but he is also kind of at the forefront of the sport, certainly in the UK scene. So don't try and just emulate him if you're currently working 9 to 5, have only really been training for the past 6 months, and then think you can go straight to training 10 sessions per week. It will not end well. So on to point number 4, then we know now how we want to play the game. We know what shapes we need to make. We know what our intent is. We know how to structure a week. Well, now how do we structure a session? So I've written down points A through F, and I'm going to run through those. And this is how a well put together strength and conditioning session is built. So largely we'll start with A. So A is obviously the warm up. Most people start fucking off the warm up. Here's a general rule of thumb. If you are old enough to remember the Now albums, i.e. Now 61, then you need to do a fucking warm up, right? You are old man cranking. You are like me now. I'm 31. You're officially into old man cranking territory. Okay. If you can remember like fucking, what was that shit? Woolworths. If you remember that shit, right? Then you need to be warming up properly, thoroughly, and effectively. So the best way to do this is a 4-letter acronym called RAMP, R-A-M-P, Romeo Alpha Mike Papa. R stands for raise. So we're going to raise your heart rate. So 5 to 10 minutes, gradually raising your heart rate and raising core temperature. So what we're looking to do here is, as I've just alluded to, start getting the body prepared for exercise. So not only are we starting to switch on certain mechanisms and neurotransmitters and stress hormones that are going to prime and optimize us to generate maximal output, but we're also increasing like the viscosity of tendons and ligaments. We're getting blood flowing through tissue. So all these things are done deliberately, yes, to prime us for exercise and output, but we're also to mitigate any potential risk of injury that could have been offset by simply making sure the tendons were viscous first. As you start to get older, especially if you've been training for a long period of time, tendons can become somewhat dry and fraught, and their tissue quality can actually drop somewhat. Whereas if you're training and warming up effectively, and we're going to push blood into those and increase the core temperature, they kind of go like gooey, and that's kind of what we want, a little bit gooey. So there's no friction, and they're not primed to snap midway through your session. So that's the R covered off. The A is activate. So we're going to activate the tissues we're specifically looking to work upon in that session. So if it's a whole body session, don't try and activate like fucking 30 tissues. We're looking for, okay, what are the ones based on the question of what shapes we need to make? What are the ones that are potentially going to cause us maybe difficulties if they're not firing or you haven't got a great connection with them? I don't like that sentiment that's not firing, because it's always firing. It's just you might not have a great neurological connection and ability to contract it at this present moment. So what are we going to activate in a whole body session? For me, like most jiu-jitsu guys after a period of time end up being built like a croissant, like they sit like a fucking prawn, because that's what the sport really demands, if I'm honest. So we need to look at, if we're going to do a whole body, there's going to be some pressing in there at some point. So we want to activate like the mid and lower trapezius and the rhomboid. So these muscles in between our shoulder blades, we're starting to retract and slightly depress our shoulder blades. That's going to be really, really important, not only for the session and for maximum like output, but also for long-term shoulder and spinal health. That's really important. Obviously, core activation is going to be really, really important. And again, because most people like to play the game like a croissant and they're sat at office or in a car, the glutes are going to need really, really firing up. Again, don't like that phrase, but for want of a better phrase, the glutes are going to really need to get fired up and warmed up to mobilize those hips as well. So that's what I'd look to activate. In terms of mobilize, that's pretty self-explanatory. So we need to mobilize the joints and start taking them through a full active range of motion. I put specific stress on the word active because like just swinging something really fast can take you into what's called a passive range of motion, i.e. you cannot put your limb there yourself with only muscular contraction, but if you swing something or throw it hard enough or lean really hard against something, then you'll push it there, but that's not really giving you an awful lot. You need to be able to contract into that range. So if we've activated the mid-low trapezius and rhomboids, for example, so there's mid-back scapular retractors and external rotators, then we might want to do a drill like the YTW drill. So contracting our shoulders and getting our shoulders mobile. We might want to look at doing fire hydrants, for hip musculature and get the femur moving around in the acetabellum, the hip socket basically. Then we're going to go on, so mobilization. Then lastly, P, we're looking at potentiation. So we're then starting to look at specific movements. So let's say, for an example, you were going to do a bench press. Your A1 was a bench press. Okay, so we'd start with low level, low load, low intensity bench press or bench press specific movements. So we might look at doing plyometric press ups. You might look at doing medicine ball push passes, and that kind of goes really nicely onto point B, which is specifics. So if there's any little specifics of injuries or niggles you've got, just spend a couple of minutes ironing those out. But then C carries on very nicely. So we've done A, ramp, we've done B, specifics. Now we're looking at C, carries really nicely on from the P of ramp. So the P of ramp was obviously potentiation. The C of the session is going to be our plyometrics and or Olympic lifts and or speed and or power work. Okay. So this is the higher velocity stuff that we're going to be doing at the beginning of the session. Now this is definitely not an essential in all S&C programs by any stretch of the imagination. If you're short for time, you may question the validity of it. But if you're looking at 4 45 to 60 minute session and you're looking at improving your performance and strength and output in jiu-jitsu, I would really highly recommend that it's in there. So, we're looking at, if you've got a squat based session, or you've got squats in your session, how can we potentiate that with plyometric lifts? Okay, cool. We could be plyometric exercises. Sorry, we could be looking at doing box jumps. We can be looking at doing band resisted jumps. If it's bench press, we could be doing incline plyometric push-ups. We could do medicine ball push passes. If it's deadlifts, we could be looking at medicine ball slam, battle rope slams. Speed definitely has a place, an enormous amount of physical preparation. But owing to the fact you're never really going to be sprinting, or hopefully you're never really going to be sprinting in jiu-jitsu sessions, specific to the sport that is, then you don't really need to look at too much at sprint mechanics, because that's a very, very complex topic in and itself and does massively increase risk of injury if you're not doing it correctly. So speed is a consideration if we're looking at, like fast repetitions of like bench press or fast reps of deadlifts, etc. But I wouldn't concern too much. Or again, Olympic lifts are a phenomenal tool to build potentiation, to build like rate of force development and stuff like that. But again, they are very, very complex, and you will have to invest a lot of time into both the mobility and the skills and the timing behind being able to facilitate that. But this is what would happen at the beginning of the session. So warming up, do our specifics, then we're into like plyometrics or power stuff. Very, very low volume, maybe 3 sets of 3, 3 sets of 5, kind of maximally. Then we're into section D, which is the strength, the fun stuff, the fucking meat and potatoes of a session. I would honestly recommend no more than kind of like 2 to 3 exercises here for true strength development. So when we're talking about strength development, obviously strength is on a continuum, there's repetition ranges, etc. This would largely depend on your experience as an athlete and what it is you hope to get. So for most people, like if you're really, really new to training in the gym, as much as maybe doing 5 repetitions, so working around about 80% of your 1 rep max is going to be optimal on paper, quote unquote. If you've never really done a bench press before, so you haven't really ingrained that motor pattern, and some fuckwit gives you 3 sets of 5 and you try it and do that, and you have no stability in your shoulder capsule, your movement fidelity is poor, and you're not able to actually like organize and orchestrate that movement, you are going to fuck your shit up. Worst case scenario, you snap something, dislocate something. Best case scenario, you ingrain a faulty movement pattern, which is going to have to be readdressed and is much harder to do later in your training life. So, if you're quite new, if you're in your sort of first 12 months of training, we would opt for a slightly higher, what's referred to as intraset volume approach. So we might look at between 8 and 12 repetitions, simply because that will force you to use a lighter load, and each repetition is basically practice. We're ingraining a motor pattern, we're looking to do it better. If you're into 18 to 24 plus months and you're intermediate going on an advanced trainee, obviously we can immediately expose you to higher intensities like 6s, 5s, 4s, even right down to 3s, or 3 sets of 3 on like a trap bar deadlift example. So when it comes to what lifts we're going to be using, we are going to come to that in a moment. We'll talk about basics to be included, but this is just how we're laying the session out. So strength, I would pick 2 maximally, and I really mean absolutely maximally, 3 lifts that you want to progress in that session. Can be as little as 1, if I'm really honest. Depends how many times you're training per week. If you're training twice per week, then maybe 2 to 3. If you're training 3 times per week, 1 to 2. Okay, it's a pretty solid rule of thumb there. Point number E would then be developing our work capacity and volume. So these are the exercises that are going to build our capacity for our muscles to do work and to tolerate lactate and other metabolites and accessory volume. So let's pretend you've done a whole body session. We've warmed up, so we did our ramp session, and then we've done our plyometrics. So I was doing deadlifts and pull-ups. So my plyometrics were med ball slams and then battle rope slashes. I did my deadlifts, did 3 sets of 5 on that. I did my pull-ups, did 3 sets of 6 on that. And then I go into my work capacity. So what is the accessory volume that would like augment that session? So I might do some face pulls, working on like scapular retraction. I could do like dumbbell pullovers again to stretch my lats out, because they've been working in isometric and mid ranges there. I could do some of that. I could do some hamstring work, so like some Nordic curls or some glute ham developments, some just posterior chain work, and we're talking here like 1 to 2 sets, maybe 1 to 3 sets of sort of 12 to 15 reps. Okay, so we're just building work capacity here. And then lastly, something that we are absolutely rigid about in the Hard to Kill program is always finish your session with breath work. Always finish your session with breath work. And that irrelevant what level you're at. Because you're going to actually immediately start calming sympathetic nervous tone. You're going to start calming the CNS. You're going to start to improve like parasympathetic nervous tones, or like valgal nerve tone, which is really important long-term as an athlete. You're going to start to get yourself out of that state of fight or flight and into rest and digest, which means that you're going to assimilate and digest food better. You're going to be able to switch back onto other tasks like work, whatever, better. If it's late in the evening, again, you're going to be able to sleep better. If it's in the morning, you're going to be able to concentrate better at work. I really can't speak highly enough to that breath work for that. But also more often than not in jiu-jitsu, you're going to find yourself in really compromising situations where you have to be able to control your breathing, because carbon dioxide in the blood is going to elevate, oxygen is going to go down. That will initiate a normal, natural, physiological human response, which is to fucking flap and panic. And if you're able to override that by practicing breath work, then you're going to be miles ahead. So look to practice box breathing at the end of every session. So that's how we would structure the session. And now, as I promised, I want to talk about basics to be included. So we spoke about point number D, which was strength. Point number D, fucking hell. We spoke about point D, which was the kind of strength lifts. And then I want to look at the basics to be included. So what are the fundamental bread and butter for an S&C program for jiu-jitsu? Well, I think everyone can come to an agreement, even if you've never even done it, but if you've watched it, there needs to be an underpinning ability to push and pull with your upper body. So specifically horizontal pushes and pulls. So when we talk about horizontal pushes, we're obviously going to be looking at derivations of a bench press. So this can be a dumbbell bench press. This could be a neutral grip bench press. This could be a floor press. This could be a pin press. This could be any one of a number of different things. And you could literally go on. This conversation could last for weeks. There's a reason that I spent 10 years studying S&C. If I could have covered it in a week, I would have done a week course. It can go on for a long time, but essentially there are pros and cons and there are all sorts. But largely pick one that you feel comfortable with. Pick one that applies to your biomechanics. Pick one that matches the shapes that you want to make and that you're able to progressively overload. It's really that simple. And again, the same with the pull. You could do pull-ups. You can do pendlay rows. You can do incline bench supported rows. You can do all those different sorts of things. It's worth going on record now as saying, honestly, for the mass consensus of general population and those who are training jiu-jitsu and grappling, I do not recommend this trend of reinventing the wheel and doing Zercher fucking deadlifts, like these old school Soviet, like outlandish strength exercises. I'm not saying they're not valid. I'm not saying they're not good. I'm not saying there isn't some strength and literature behind them. What I'm saying is if your body is not prepared to do them, you will snap your shit. If you look at the mechanics of, for example, the Zercher deadlift and the range you need to be able to get into to pick a fucking bar off the floor with your forearms, 9 times out of 10, if an individual is a hobbyist grappler, drives a lot, and or sits down for a living, and that you're just going to fucking herniate your back. You are literally going to herniate a disc. It's really, really not worth it just so you can look cool on Instagram. Okay, so really, really do stick with the fundamental basics here. I cannot speak highly enough to that. So horizontal pushes and pulls. Then we look at some hinges. So by a hinge, you're obviously going to be looking at derivations of hip thrusts and deadlifts. So, we could be looking at Romanian deadlifts here. We could be looking at conventional deadlifts. I'd argue maybe not that much of a place for sumo deadlifts, but the king here is a trap bar deadlift for me. The trap bar deadlift really does tick so many boxes, both posterior chain development, knee robustness, lower limb force development, into intersegmental stability, core robustness and rigidity. It really does tick so many boxes, right through up to isometric contractions of the trapezius, so stabilizing the neck, really does tick so many boxes. So I definitely look to include that. But there are no definite, if you're an individual listening to this and say, okay, I would love to do that, but I've got fucking 3 herniated discs, then you don't have to do it. There's always more than one way to skin a cat. That's why today I wanted to talk about the overarching considerations rather than just giving you a list of exercises. We then also want to look at fortifying the things that are particularly vulnerable in grappling sport. So I'm specifically referring to the shoulder, the knee, the neck, and the elbows. Anyone who has been a bit overzealous early in their training career with grappling will know what golfer's elbow and tennis elbow feels like. It is awful. When you've been clinging on to another human who's desperately trying not to be clinged onto, and your arms are throbbing, your hands are shaking, you can't even lift your elbows up. It is excruciating. It's awful. It stops you sleeping, you train, you can't lift. It's horrendous. And the thing is, it's so easily avoidable. If you're just looking to train the forearm extensors as well as the flexors, and you're doing things like barbell rolls, you're doing like force hammering exercise like that, you're going to mitigate it pretty much immediately. Neck, so we're looking at neck flexion, neck extension, and we're looking at rotation in both directions. The knee, so we want to be deliberately driving knees over toes. Just a word here on knees over toes guy, because that's probably one of the most common messages I receive on Instagram is, have you seen knees over toes guy? He's been very, very good at bringing it to the public light, but doing if drinking 1 liter of water hydrates you, drinking 8 liters of water doesn't make you hydrated, right? So be really, really clear on that taking one thing and then just hammering it to death to the nth degree does not necessarily make it better or more efficacious. This is the stuff that we've known in S&T circles for generations and for definitely decades, of just taking the knee into the end range of knee flexion is going to increase blood flow to the knee. It's going to lower the tendons effectively. So it's going to improve the performance and the happiness of the knee. So definitely be doing that. And also with regards to the shoulder, what we're specifically looking at here is not those remedial exercises that you see people doing that make zero sense of standing there with a band and doing external rotations against no resistance. So we want to be looking at taking our shoulder through a full active range of motion. So for that, we'd be looking at things like, dumbbell pullovers as much as is safe. We would be looking at like banded stretches of the lats and the pecs and all this sort of stuff to make sure our shoulders are as healthy as can be. But the overarching consensus with your training here needs to be just strength at length. Okay, like pretty much everyone who's listening to this who has experience in the gym will be already pretty competent, pretty strong in what we call the mid-range of a muscle tissue. And I don't want to go too much into the depths and nuances of that. But like for example, a bench press, you're already going to be pretty strong. Squat, like off a box, you're probably already going to be pretty strong. What creates and poses a real injury risk in grappling sports is that someone is maybe against your will going to accidentally force you into the end of a range. If you imagine doing a bench press right now and your shoulders feel fine at the bottom of that, okay, now take that bicep back like another 8 inches. Does it still feel fine or is it a bit tight? Because that's the angle you may unwillingly find yourself in if you're in a crucifix position or, if you get armbarred. So actually using strength sessions to take your body into those ranges safely in a controlled environment and learning to develop force and express strength there is going to protect you to the nth degree. Physiologically, it is going to allow your body to know it's safe there, express force from there and fortify and make robust the tendons and ligaments. Psychologically, you're going to build a map. There's a part of your brain called the homunculus that basically has like a map of where everything is in space at all times, and it needs to understand. So if you've programmed that it's fine in that range, you're going to be so much more protected and so much safer. Now, quickly want to touch on volume, because volume for most people is the precursor to hypertrophy. Like you need a certain amount of volume in order to build muscle. You can absolutely do it. Like you 1,000,000% can build muscle while training jiu-jitsu multiple times per week. But you have to understand that the volume comes with a trade-off. Volume, and more specifically muscle protein synthesis and growing muscle, is arguably one of the most energy expensive processes your body can operate. So do not try and accrue lean tissue. Do not try and get bigger by having more volume in a competitive phase. So if you've got comps coming up, right, you do not need to be worrying about getting bigger. No one is ever going to tap just because you fucking like have an extra inch on your biceps. Like it's not going to happen. In that stage, you would like volume to be as low as is appropriate to send the signal, but you would be largely basing around high intensity and like higher loading. If, however, like for me and for many people, you're like not particularly competitively oriented with this sport, my days of competition are, I feel quite behind me. I'm always happy to be proven wrong, but for me, like it's not my primary concern right now. Then you can arguably increase the volume a little bit, because it means that you're gonna look good, you're gonna feel like your shirt really well and that sort of shit. But understand that volume will and does come with a trade-off. Okay, so don't go smashing the ass out loads of bicep curls and doing like 15 sets of bench press, because it's probably going to slow you down and cause some overwhelm and wear and tear. In terms of like I touched on point E in the session, work capacity and volume. One thing I frequently get asked is about strongman stuff, like modified strongman training and sandbag carries and kettlebell stuff. That is largely where you would aspire to put in your work capacity element. So doing like isometric holds, doing like bags over the shoulder, like isometric holds of sandbags, like farmers walks. These are all brilliant exercises, like really, really phenomenal exercises, not only for strength, but also start to develop a little bit more conditioning element in your training as well. But, that can be done. And this is largely why I wanted to split this up into multi-episodic series, is so that I can cover that in more depth and greater detail in the next episode, because I've spoken for nearly a fucking hour purely on the strength, and I could have gone into a lot more depth in this. But in next episode, we will be talking about the conditioning elements of jiu-jitsu and training and preparing for that. So then modified strongman training and all that sort of stuff will start to become more prevalent, because I definitely do see enormous amount of value in it, like an enormous amount of transferability to an athlete, but I don't believe it should be the only physical preparation that an individual does. But that's pretty much in a nutshell strength for jiu-jitsu. If there's any high-level guys out there, prolific competitors, anybody who's interested in this and wants to feed back, whether you think I'm totally full of shit, I genuinely really, really value that. I would love to be proven wrong. Genuinely, honestly, would love to be proven wrong. And I'd love to have open conversation and debate about about this. People, if you're enjoying it and you feel like this has positively influenced and impacted your preparation for your sport, or furthered your expanding, then I would honestly love to hear your feedback. Please really do share it across your Instagram, because this is part of my kind of commitment and my life mission to put good quality, robust and evidence-based information in front of as many people as I possibly can, to ensure that they're able to follow their path towards mastery, and without running into the friction and difficulties and challenges that I ran into over the past couple of decades, purely because good information wasn't readily available. So really would appreciate that. But otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Very much looking forward to further ones. Cheers.